Imagine Savannah, 1839, a city draped in elegance, its streets shaded by moss and silence. Beneath its grace lies a code older than conscience, the belief that status is salvation and appearance is everything. In this world, the widow stands alone. Her husband's death freed her name, but chained her future. To society, she was a woman to be watched, not for what she did, but for what she might dare to do. A widow with land, wealth, and youth was both a prize and a threat. She could inherit power, yet she must never use it in ways that disrupted the hierarchy of men or the purity of the white line. Her mourning gown became a uniform, her composure a mask. She learned early that in Savannah's parlors, grief was not meant to ache. It was meant to perform. The black veil did not symbolize loss, it symbolized decorum. She was expected to be graceful in tragedy, obedient in prosperity, and silent in thought. Yet, as the months turned to years, her silence began to ferment into something else, reflection. And reflection is always dangerous to systems built on blindness. You see, there's a strange kind of awakening that happens when a person has nothing left to lose. When the last duty has been fulfilled, the last tear shed, what remains is not despair, it is clarity. This widow began to see her world not as it was praised to be, but as it truly was. The plantation that had sustained her comfort now whispered to her of captivity. The walls that sheltered her had been built by hands that were never free to rest. Every polished floor, every silver spoon carried the faint echo of a sigh, and slowly, conscience began to interrupt privilege. She began to question if her peace depended on another's pain. Was it peace at all? Society, however, offered no room for such questions. In Savannah, to question was to sin. To feel compassion for those beneath you was to threaten the order that kept you above. And so she smiled in public, as all Southern ladies were trained to do. But within her, something rebelled. The rebellion did not begin with words or politics. It began with perception. She saw the human where others saw property. She heard the music in voices others dismissed as noise. That's how revolutions are born, quietly, in the human heart, long before the world takes notice. In the nights of her solitude, she remembered her husband's final words about honor and bloodlines, about legacy and control. But those words began to sound hollow now. The gospel of men afraid to lose dominion. She understood that the South's greatest fear was not rebellion or poverty, it was intimacy. Because intimacy dissolves hierarchy. When you truly see another person as equal, the entire structure of ownership collapses. That realization became her private gospel. And yet, she was still human, still bound by habit and hesitation. There were moments when she would almost convince herself that she could endure it all, the empty gestures, the polite slavery of reputation. But truth, once glimpsed, cannot be unseen. It lingers in the conscience, gnawing at the edges of comfort. And it was in this state of moral disquiet that she first noticed him. The young man whose presence the household preferred to forget, the son of a slave and a master. He carried himself not with arrogance but with awareness. His gaze did not lower as custom demanded. It met hers, not in defiance but in recognition. For in his eyes, she saw reflected the same kind of isolation she lived in. The same quiet knowledge that neither truly belonged to the world around them. He was bound by skin, she was bound by propriety. And between those two prisons lay a narrow path of forbidden understanding. To the world outside, their connection was invisible, but within her, it marked the beginning of transformation. That moment was less about romance and more about revelation. She began to realize that love is not always born from desire. Sometimes it's born from shared alienation. The widow's heart had been trained to be dutiful, not discerning. But here was someone who mirrored her loneliness without demanding her performance. And that recognition unsettled her more deeply than any sermon or scandal ever could. Her story, then, is not merely one of love across color. It's one of awakening across conscience. She stands at the threshold between two eras, one dying, one not yet born. Every choice she makes becomes a question addressed to the future. How long can a society survive when its laws punish compassion? How long can a soul pretend ignorance in exchange for acceptance? These were not abstract moral dilemmas. They were fires burning quietly in the human heart, waiting for the spark that would make them visible. In her quiet defiance, we see the anatomy of courage. Courage does not always roar or march, sometimes it simply refuses to continue lying. The widow's rebellion began not when she married her slave son, but when she decided that truth mattered more than reputation. And perhaps that is where her story meets ours, because every generation faces its own version of Savannah, a world that asks us to conform, to keep peace by ignoring pain. But history doesn't remember the obedient, it remembers the awakened. She was called scandalous, mad, unholy. Yet, through her defiance, she became something her critics could never be: honest. Her story reminds us that dignity without conscience is only decorum, and power without love is only fear. And maybe that's what the widow understood better than anyone, that to live without truth is a quieter kind of death. He was born in silence, as most forbidden things are, in the back house of a grand Savannah estate, where voices spoke in whispers and truth had to hide its face. His mother was a slave woman, steady, strong, and too wise for the small world she was trapped in. His father, the master of that house, a man who lived by two codes, one public, one private. And between those two codes, a child was born, the son of possession and hypocrisy, carrying in his very existence the contradiction of a civilization. From the beginning, he lived between worlds. The white world denied him, the black world distrusted him, and the law had no language for what he was. He was neither one thing nor the other. In a society built upon division, his existence was a quiet revolution, proof that the walls separating the powerful from the powerless were already cracking from within. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw the face of a world that refused to name him. That kind of existence shapes the soul in a peculiar way. It makes one alert, observant, inwardly old before the body grows tall. The lady of the house, after her husband's death, rarely looked toward the slave quarters. But if she had, she might have seen in this young man a kind of dignity that defied design. He was taught to bow, to answer softly, to stay invisible. Yet there was something in him that refused erasure. His eyes carried a quiet question that few dared to ask aloud: who decides what a man is worth? He had no teacher, yet he learned from everything. The sermons whispered through open windows, the scraps of scripture discarded by the master's children, the patterns of nature that revealed to him what human law tried to hide, that no soul is born inferior. Sometimes, the greatest education is not given, it is stolen. In the hours after labor, he taught himself letters by the dim glow of a candle. Words became his first form of freedom. In the rhythm of reading, he found something sacred, not merely knowledge but identity, because literacy for the enslaved was never just about learning. It was about reclaiming one's right to exist as a mind. It was about lifting thought above ownership. And once a man begins to think freely, he can never again belong to another. The people who ruled over him could chain his body, but they could not chain his awareness. And awareness, that quiet, invisible rebellion, is what every unjust system fears the most. He learned the language of his oppressors not to imitate them, but to understand the very structure of their power. That is what made him dangerous. He knew how they spoke, how they justified, how they prayed over cruelty. He saw that their religion was not faith, it was order. And once he understood that, he could no longer pretend that bondage was natural. But he also carried a deep wound, the wound of divided blood. He was the product of his master's sin and his mother's suffering, and every heartbeat reminded him that he belonged nowhere. The world told him he was a mistake, yet nature kept insisting that he was proof of truth, that humanity cannot be divided by decree. That paradox carved both humility and fire into him. He grew not resentful, but resolute. While others cursed the cruelty, he studied it. While others broke, he endured. That endurance became his quiet strength, not the endurance of submission, but of knowing. There was a certain hour, late in the evening, when he would stand near the edge of the great house, looking at the lights through the windows. He was close enough to see the elegance, yet far enough to be reminded that he was never meant to touch it. And in that distance, something profound was born in him, the awareness that separation itself was the lie. The air that brushed his cheek was the same that filled their rooms. The God they prayed to was the same that heard his mother's cries. The difference was not divine. It was man-made, As he grew, he became indispensable to the estate, educated enough to manage accounts, articulate enough to interpret orders, skilled enough to earn trust. Yet beneath that trust, he carried a dangerous kind of self-knowledge. The widow began to notice it. The way he moved with both discipline and dignity, the way he carried silence not as fear but as command. He did not ask for validation, yet his presence demanded it. And that was the beginning of something history would never forgive. Not love at first sight, but recognition. She saw in him the reflection of her own captivity. He saw in her the same hunger for freedom he carried since birth. It is important to understand his defiance was never loud. It was moral. His rebellion was not in words but in being, in existing fully where he was never meant to exist at all. That kind of strength, quiet and self-contained, threatens systems more than any uprising, because the moment a man begins to see himself as whole, the master loses control. In this young man's life, we see a parable that stretches beyond Savannah, beyond 1839, beyond slavery itself. We see the eternal struggle between imposed identity and inherent worth. Every generation faces it, in different forms, in different chains. The world still tries to decide who is worthy, who is allowed to belong, who gets to define truth. And still, there are those who rise from the margins, refusing invisibility. He was not born free, yet he became freer than those who ruled him. Because freedom is not always the absence of chains, sometimes it is the refusal to accept them as truth. And that, perhaps, is the lesson buried in his life, that even in a world built on denial, the human soul keeps insisting on its own visibility. It began quietly, as forbidden things often do, not with passion but with presence. A glance held too long, a conversation that outlasted its excuse, the faint realization that two people, from opposite ends of an unforgiving world, had begun to see one another not as roles, but as souls. The widow and the slave's son did not intend rebellion. Rebellion was the inevitable consequence of their honesty. Their affection was born in the narrow spaces of decency, small gestures of compassion, exchanged in a house built on cruelty. She spoke to him not as a servant but as a mind. He listened not as a subordinate but as a human being. And that, in 1839 Savannah, was enough to start an earthquake. At first she mistook her curiosity for kindness. The conversations that began with gratitude for his diligence grew into discussions of scripture, of literature, of freedom, subjects she could not speak of among her peers. He challenged her in ways no man had, not through defiance but through truth. He asked questions that stripped her of pretense. How can one soul own another? How can a man's worth be measured by the accident of his birth? These were not accusations, they were mirrors, and she could not look away. In him, she saw what her own heart had been searching for, someone unafraid to speak from a place untouched by society's performance. He did not flatter her grief, nor bow to her wealth. He simply existed before her with an authenticity that disarmed her training. That was his quiet power. He did not try to impress her, he forced her to confront herself. And the more she listened, the less she recognized the world she had once accepted as truth. There is a strange transformation that occurs when affection grows in a forbidden space. What begins as comfort becomes clarity. Love, in such moments, ceases to be sentimental. It becomes revelatory. It shows you who you are and who you have been pretending to be. For her, this love was not simply an emotional rebellion, it was an existential awakening. Every moment spent in his presence stripped away a layer of illusion. Every word reminded her that all the refinement she had been taught to uphold was, in truth, only a more elegant form of cruelty. And yet, this was not a story of seduction. It was a story of recognition. Two beings raised in opposite cages, one gilded, one rusted, realizing that both were prisons just the same. They were bound by the same lie, though it had been told to them differently. He had been taught he was less, she had been taught she was more. Both, in their own ways, were enslaved to a fiction that neither had created. Their connection broke that spell, not through romance but through truth. When affection becomes rebellion, it doesn't need to shout. It simply refuses to obey. Their moments together were small but seismic, a conversation at dusk, a shared prayer, a silence too intimate to be mistaken for anything else. In those spaces, time seemed to pause as if even history hesitated to intrude. But make no mistake, in the South of 1839, that silence was a revolution. For a white woman to see a black man as equal was not merely scandalous, it was treason. It threatened the theological, legal, and economic architecture that held the entire Southern world together. The widow knew this, of course. Every fiber of her social upbringing screamed against what she was feeling. Her mind argued with her heart, invoking scripture, decorum, fear. But the human soul does not bargain with truth for long, and the truth was simple. She loved him, not as a master loves possession, but as one soul recognizes another. For him, love was even more dangerous. He understood what it meant to be seen by someone who was not allowed to see him. Every conversation, every glance, carried the risk of ruin, not just for her reputation, but for his life. Yet he did not retreat. Perhaps because he had already lived his life under the shadow of death, perhaps because love for him was the only freedom he had ever truly known. They both understood that this affection could destroy them. And still, they continued, because something within them believed that truth, even when it costs everything, is still worth more than the safety of a lie. That is the quiet conviction that drives every forbidden love, the knowledge that even if the world condemns it, it is closer to God than all the sanctified hatred dressed in respectability. When their hands brushed for the first time, it was not lust that ignited, but recognition. For a fleeting moment, centuries of division vanished. There were no chains, no titles, no laws, only two human beings standing before one another, stripped of illusion. It was in that instant that affection became rebellion, because in loving him she refused to maintain the lie, and in receiving her love, he refused to accept his erasure. Together, they broke a code older than either of them, simply by seeing one another fully. Their connection became both sanctuary and sentence. They could not exist in public, so their love lived in the margins, in glances, in silence, in the spaces where truth hides when the world cannot bear to see it. But even hidden love leaves traces. It changes the way one walks, speaks, and dreams. It gives courage to the timid and conscience to the complicit. And though they may not have realized it then, their small defiance was planting a seed that would outlive them both, the seed of equality born not from law but from compassion. That is the paradox of forbidden love. It begins in secrecy but ends in revelation. What was hidden to preserve life often becomes the very truth that gives meaning to it. Their story reminds us that the greatest revolutions do not always begin with armies or speeches. They begin with two hearts daring to recognize one another in a world built on blindness. And perhaps that is the message for us today, that every act of genuine human recognition is, in its own way, a rebellion. Because whenever you choose compassion over conformity, whenever you choose understanding over prejudice, you are continuing the same revolution they began. There are moments in history when law and love stand face to face, and one must fall. The story of the widow and the slave's son reached that point of collision. It was no longer a quiet understanding between two people. It had become a challenge to the very architecture of power that governed Savannah's soul. Theirs was not merely a private union, it was a public heresy. Because in 1839 Georgia love was legal only when it served order, and order meant separation. The law of the land dictated who could touch, who could speak, who could dream. Everything beyond that line was branded sin, scandal, or sedition. For the widow, the law had always been something distant, an invisible structure that guaranteed her comfort. It existed to protect people like her, to shield their property, preserve their class, and sanctify their superiority. But now, she saw it differently. For the first time, the law was no longer her protection. It was her prison. Because the moment she chose to love honestly, that same law she once upheld rose up to condemn her. It was a bitter awakening. She realized that injustice always feels invisible to those who benefit from it, until the day they step outside its favor. The South's legal system in that era was not simply about governance. It was about theology masquerading as order. The church sanctified segregation, the courts enforced it, and society worshipped it. They called it purity, virtue, tradition. But underneath those polished words was fear. Fear of losing control, fear of facing equality, fear of admitting that the entire edifice of slavery rested on a lie. Every law defending racial separation was, at its core, an attempt to maintain a world where one group could live without conscience. And yet, here was a woman who had everything to gain by obeying that system and everything to lose by defying it. And still, she chose defiance. What made her dangerous was not her rebellion, but her reasoning. She did not act out of passion, she acted out of conviction. She began to see that morality and legality are not the same. The law, after all, is written by the powerful. Morality, however, is whispered by the soul, and when those two conflict, the honest heart will always have to choose which one to obey. That choice cost her everything. She knew that once her intentions became known, she would not only lose her standing but her safety. The very neighbors who had once brought her casseroles in mourning would now cross the street to avoid her gaze. The same ministers who praised her piety would soon preach her damnation, but she also knew something deeper, that truth demands a price, and every generation must decide whether to pay it or to live in debt to hypocrisy. He, too, understood the stakes. For him, the law was a constant shadow. He had never known a day when his life was not at the mercy of another's signature. The law had declared him half human, half commodity. It told him he could not read, could not testify, could not love. Yet he read, he spoke, he loved. Every breath he took was a quiet rebellion. To stand beside her was not simply an act of affection. It was an act of emancipation, because by accepting her love, he was rejecting centuries of imposed inferiority. He was daring to live as though God, not man, defined his worth. Their union became a living argument against the order of the South. It said something that terrified those in power, that love, when genuine, knows no master. It cannot be legislated, bought, or owned. It defies hierarchy because it recognizes only humanity, and that is why it was criminalized, not because it corrupted society, but because it exposed its corruption. Imagine the hypocrisy of that world. Men who fathered children with enslaved women, yet publicly condemned race mixing. Preachers who spoke of divine order, but ignored divine compassion. Judges who swore oaths to justice yet sentenced mercy to silence. The entire system was built on the performance of virtue while practicing violence. And when the widow and the young man stood together, they became the living evidence that the South's moral stage was built on sand. There is a deep psychological truth in this story. When people are enslaved, it is not enough for the oppressor to control their bodies. They must also control their language, their laws, their definitions of right and wrong. That is how oppression survives, not by force alone, but by making its victims believe it is righteous. The widow broke that illusion. In loving him, she refused to call evil good, and once a soul sees the difference, it cannot return to blindness. You see, there's a reason societies fear love more than rebellion. Rebellion challenges power, love dissolves it. It humanizes those who were meant to remain abstract. It blurs the neat categories that justify cruelty. Love, when pure, is a form of truth, and truth has always been the enemy of systems built on lies. Their marriage, illegal, condemned, erased, was, in essence, a covenant between two truths, that no man can own another, and no law can dictate the boundaries of the soul. In defying the law of flesh, they fulfilled a higher law, the law of conscience. That's what makes their story not merely a tragedy, but a prophecy. They lived in the age of ownership, yet they chose belonging. They lived in the age of chains, yet they chose connection. When history later tried to erase them, it was not out of hatred alone, but fear. Fear that their union had already planted something indestructible in the soil of human consciousness. Because once love crosses the forbidden line, the line itself begins to fade. And so their legacy lingers, not as scandal, but as scripture for the awakened. They remind us that legality is not the measure of righteousness, that sometimes the highest form of obedience is disobedience, to injustice, to cruelty, to the comfortable lie. When the truth finally surfaced, Savannah did not whisper, it roared. Word of the widow's marriage spread faster than fire through dry cane fields. One morning, what had been a private act of devotion became a public crime. People who had once nodded politely to her in the marketplace now crossed the street as she passed. The same society that once pitied her widowhood now condemned her humanity, and in that violent shift we see the true face of moral outrage. It is rarely about right and wrong. It is about control. Savannah's streets became stages of judgment. In parlors and pews, her name became a cautionary tale. Preachers thundered from pulpits that her union was an abomination before God. Newspapers called her fallen, mad, unclean. Neighbors spoke her name with the same tone they used for disease. But what truly disturbed them was not the act itself. It was what the act revealed. Her choice stripped away the illusion that Southern virtue was built on honor. It exposed that their entire moral code was designed to preserve comfort, not conscience. That is the nature of scandal. It reveals what society fears to face within itself. The outrage was not born of purity but of exposure. When she chose love over hierarchy, she held up a mirror, and Savannah saw its reflection without the filter of sanctimony. The people who had once dined at her table now recoiled, not because she had sinned more than they, but because she had dared to be honest in a world addicted to deception. She became what every society creates when truth becomes too sharp to bear, a scapegoat, a vessel into which they could pour all their suppressed guilt. In condemning her, they cleansed themselves. They needed her fall to maintain their illusion of righteousness. Because as long as she was wrong, they could remain right. And so, they turned her into the embodiment of everything they secretly were: afraid, divided, desperate to appear clean. There is a strange comfort in watching another person crucified for what we secretly desire. It gives the illusion of distance from our own contradictions. Savannah's citizens needed her to fall because her defiance made their obedience unbearable. Her courage reminded them of their silence. Her compassion mocked their indifference. Her love shattered the fragile logic that had justified their world for generations. And so they attacked her not as an individual, but as an idea that threatened their order. The widow, however, did not defend herself in the way they expected. She did not plead insanity, nor did she repent. She met their fury with quiet composure. The same dignity that once made her admired now made her terrifying. Because calm truth unsettles the furious lie. They screamed to shame her, but she did not flinch. In her silence, she spoke something louder than words, that she no longer belonged to their world. And that's what frightened them most. When a person ceases to need approval, they become untouchable. She had crossed that threshold. What they called disgrace, she called freedom. What they saw as madness, she experienced as awakening. For the first time, she lived according to her own soul, not society's script. That kind of liberation is rare and dangerous to witness, because when one person stands free, it forces everyone else to question their own captivity. He too bore the brunt of the scandal. For him, the price was higher and crueler. The law that tolerated her shunned him entirely. Whispers of punishment grew into threats, but even he refused to flee. Their love had already destroyed the illusion of hierarchy. Now it would test the strength of conviction. And though they were hunted by shame, they found in each other something their accusers would never know: peace. Not the peace of acceptance, but the peace that comes from truth. In time, the scandal consumed itself. Like all moral panics, it burned bright and then faded, leaving behind the quiet ache of realization. People moved on to new gossip, new distractions, new ways to hide from themselves. But something had changed. The city could no longer pretend its laws and its faith were unshakable. A single act of honesty had cracked the foundation. That's how change begins, not with parliaments but with pariahs. Psychologically, her story reveals a pattern that repeats across all eras: the instinct to destroy what threatens our illusion of order. Humanity often confuses comfort with morality. We worship stability, even when it's built on injustice. But there comes a moment in every society and in every soul when the truth refuses to stay buried. And when it surfaces, the world always reacts the same way, first with outrage, then with denial, and finally with reluctant awe. Because deep down we recognize truth when we see it, even if we crucify it first. That's why the widow's story endures. It's not just about her marriage. It's about the cost of authenticity. It asks a question every listener must confront: what would you be willing to lose to live honestly? She lost everything: her name, her standing, her place in the world. But she kept her soul. And perhaps that's the choice we all face in smaller, quieter ways. The choice between being praised for conformity or condemned for truth. History remembers her not because she broke a rule, but because she exposed the emptiness behind the rules themselves. And if we are honest, her courage still calls to us. It asks whether we are brave enough to live beyond approval, to love beyond permission, to act beyond fear. Whether we can stand, as she did, in the full light of truth, knowing the world might never understand. Because sometimes the price of truth is exile, but the reward is freedom.